A couple months after I joined, I had never been to Africa before, quite ignorant about this, and kind of took for granted the electricity we have and what that allows. So I went over and I spent a bunch of time. I visited our shops, but I spent a couple days and went out to visit the homes of our customers. And it was first day, it was a super long day. Visited about 12 homes, and sometimes we're walking like a kilometer through fields to get to this one home. And I remember being in one home and going in, and I had someone who was helping interpret. And I went there with all these questions about like, well, do you like the torch better than the lantern? What would you like to see? Like all these very technical, consumer insight driven questions. And this one dad who had 3 little children around, he just came up and hugged me. And he said, thank you for helping me get rid of kerosene so I don't have to listen to my children coughing anymore. And I'm choking up just saying it now. And after, I don't know, super long day, I went back to the hotel that night and I called my wife in Toronto and I was crying. I said, I can't believe this is what I get to do as my job. And so absolutely, it's life-changing in so many different ways that we would just take for granted. So it's amazing waking up the next morning, realizing there's 100 or 200 families that today have access to electricity that didn't yesterday. And then that's what we've been able to do in the last 24 hours. So it's life-changing for them and certainly for me as well.
And then I U-turned into this apartment complex, and then outside there's a group of kids playing soccer. They had rocks set up as goals or playing with a really raggedy soccer ball. And it reminded me of home, of the way I grew up playing soccer in the streets of Jordan with my cousins and neighbors and friends. And I watched the kids play, and I'd been coaching club soccer for a while. And so I had a ball in my trunk, grabbed that. Boys saw that, they wanted the ball, I wanted to play. Universal language of soccer. We haggled and they let me into their game. And so I would say everything started with soccer, and that's core to who we are. It's a universal language. The initial group I met were from Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Liberia. Yeah, it was then my education into refugees and how they're treated in the United States. And then my responsibility to do something.
But how do you said your responsibility. Boy, I think it's a lot of ours responsibility, but there are very few people who really step up. What was that one driving motivator that said, was there something, or is it just something that you absolutely felt you had to do?
I think it was that slow unraveling, right? Like I'm coaching kids and some of my players don't know how to read, right? And my parents sent me to British and American schools growing up because they believed that was the best the world had to offer. And I believed every school in the United States was like my State Department run high school in Jordan. Because I was like, this is what America gives. And I was so wrong. And I'd read about that in college. I'd taken classes, but it doesn't really hit you until it's face to face and it's people are being affected. I felt I was 2 degrees removed from that experience, change a few details that could have been me or my family. If these were my kids, my own kids, what would I do? And that's why I acted. It wasn't this like master plan. It was like, oh wait, like players are not reading. Like what's the point if like we can play soccer, we can feel good for like 3-4 hours a week, but what happens after that?
What makes people succeed in life? What makes them achieve things? And that's when on a trip to Israel, I was giving a lecture on computerized assessment, and I met psychologist Reuven Bar-On, who was trying to publish this tool that was his PhD dissertation back in the 80s, something called the emotional quotient. And he was rejected by all the major publishers in the US and in Europe. And it was the kind of thing we were looking for. It needed a bit of work still, and we decided to work with him, and that became emotional intelligence. So we basically published the world's first tool of emotional intelligence. So when Dan Goleman's book called Emotional Intelligence came out in 1995, we were there. We're the only ones in the world that had a tool that measured this thing. And Goldman knew about our tool and actually had referred to it on a number of occasions. So we just really exploded in the area of emotional intelligence. And the goal there, I wanted to bring that into the workplace. I wanted to use it to help develop people, develop leaders, individual contributors, managers, to really reach and touch upon skills that really weren't being talked about in the workplace. You know, like emotional skills. I was laughed out of England. I remember giving a talk in London at HR conference where some old guy yelled at me, "In England, we don't have emotions at work. We leave them at home." You know, it was like unbelievable.
I realized that I wanted to change the world when in high school, I started my first job in retail. And I was treated differently just because I was wearing a headscarf. And so I wanted to work on changing that, but not only for me, for everyone who looked different. So I wanted to feel safe, and most importantly, I wanted to educate people. And so I started with a student organization in Columbus State Community College, and one of the events that we did was, it's called the Hijab Day. So we had like a table, and people can come and ask us questions. And any questions we get, we can give a candy bag to the person who asks. So, and we had a mirror, and we had scarves, and they can try scarves on, and they can take it for free. And so the whole point of this event was to make people safe to come and ask us questions, so we can educate them. And so when I got to Knowlton and got to NOMA, it was now more specific goal to educate people, but in a different way, to also change the new generation and kind of bring more people from the younger generation to not only educate people, but to show how amazing these minorities can be. And so that's definitely it. That was my goal to how to change the world and how to make people feel safe and educated. We're all very similar. We just need to literally just talk to each other, and that was what NOMA is doing. Yesterday we did have an event in OSU to talk to the students, and a lot of the students just came to us to ask us, like, what happens after you graduate? What do we need to do? And all these conversations make me realize that what we're doing is very important, and that we're connecting with the younger generation, either in NOMAS or even in the School of Art or the Center of Architecture and Design. And so I've learned that we needed people to help us when we were younger, but then also that made us help others. And that's something that everyone is realizing now, and everyone wants to help with that.
I was part of a 6-woman team. There were 4 of us on the boat at any one time. We rowed from San Francisco in the US all the way across to Cairns in Australia. It was a 3-stage row, so we made 2 stopovers, one in Hawaii and one in Samoa, where we restocked the boat with food and supplies, and we swapped in 1 team member. So 3 of us rowed the full 9-month journey, because it actually ended up taking us 9 months in total. It was supposed to take 6, but ended up taking 50% longer at 9 months. So 3 of us rode the full 9-month journey, and the other 3 team members rotated in Samoa, in Hawaii and Samoa. And that journey was, as you can imagine, a once in a lifetime experience. It taught me so many things about having to stay in the moment, dealing with things that you can only control, so not worrying about the uncontrollable, because we had unfavorable winds and currents that pushed us in the wrong direction. We would have these days where we would row for 24 hours and we would actually travel backwards. So that demoralizing, just constantly being battered by Mother Nature, essentially. I mean, we were at the mercy of Mother Nature out there. We were as prepared as we could be, but we were in the middle of the ocean, so we were battling the elements. And not only battling the elements, but battling the mental inner demons that each of us went through, because we each dealt with challenges very differently. So the 6 of us came together specifically for this expedition. We didn't know each other beforehand, so we were also having to learn about each other, personality profiling, learning how to work together as a team, building that trust and respect, which I think is the most important things you need to have within a team to really cement that relationship. So I was completely overwhelmed with this expedition. It was like nothing I'd ever done before. So just to let you know, I had never rowed before, ever. And I'll probably never row again. So everything about it was new and unknown and challenging. Coming back from that expedition, there were so many elements of it that I kept with me that ended up helping me when COVID hit. So being out in the middle of the ocean, there was so much monotony and so much challenge. We rowed in 2-hour shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day. So we got into this routine.
9 months.
For 9 months, yeah. We slept in a cabin that was the size of a single bed, essentially, that we shared with one of the other teammates, one of the girls. So 2 of us in this tiny, claustrophobic, cramped space, incredibly uncomfortable. But when COVID hit, obviously you could leave your house from time to time if you wanted to, whereas on the ocean, there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. So what I found was mentally, I needed to start looking for positives wherever I could. What we did was we initiated this exercise where we would each day in our rowing pairs, we would talk about what our daily highlight was. So something every day that made us smile or made us laugh or was just a little bit different to the other monotonous sort of 2-hour shifts that we went through. And it was just that exercise that we started getting into of looking for a positive every day, just constantly looking for those positives. And I think that was something that happened during COVID. You know, we were all forced into this unknown situation. During lockdown, we couldn't leave the house. You know, everyone was challenged in different ways. And I found myself making myself look for the positive every day. And I think there's something to be said for celebrating little successes wherever you can, rather than concentrating on negatives.
In surgery, unfortunately, they don't have a way to do this, what we were talking about, you know, doing a rehearsal ahead of time. So they're learning on the go by practicing sort of on their first set of patients. And even with that said, as they go on and become competent and, you know, start excelling in their skills to perform these surgeries, there are always cases where there is a oddball case and you've never seen that before. And there was no opportunity for you to have that experience ahead of the curve.
So how real is the experience that you provide?
Yeah. So
it's very real.
So we can like share a video if
Sure.
that works. But also I can show you just what some of our models look like. So here is a heart, and I can give it a good squeeze. So in a real surgical rehearsal, this heart, if it was cut into, actually has all of the internal anatomy as well as a defect that was derived from the patient's imaging data sets. And then also it can be perfused. So if they were to cut into a structure that was critical to this procedure and create a complication, they would be able to experience that on the rehearsal, during the rehearsal on the pre-shore model ahead of the curve.
But ADHD, so it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it's one of these collectives of conditions, we'll call them. I refuse to call them a disability, that are under this umbrella term known as neurodiversity, which in itself is a bit of a misnomer because we're all neurodiverse. Nobody has the same brain, but some people's brains are wired a little bit differently.
It seems like because you have this personal relationship with it, if you will, you've done your own research to understand yourself. Is that sort of how you came about it?
Absolutely, and research is the perfect word, because I'm going to throw that right back at you, Ken, and because you and your sidekick Sonia have clearly done your research and your homework. I get asked to go on podcasts and interviewed across the world all the time, and nobody's actually asked me about my human geography degree. And I guess so well done, and thank you. Like, I really appreciate that. That means a lot that you've actually bothered, and I think that's also a characteristic of my neurodiversity, because I also have, I'm dyslexic and I have dyscalculia as well, which is, I guess, the numbers version of dyslexia.
To me, grade strategy, it has the nature of divergence and convergence.
Yeah.
How do you manage through convergence when you've got to stick to, at some point you've got to stick?
Yeah. Oh wow! Look, we could do an entire episode on that. I like so the two terms you've used, converge and diverge. This is, I guess, the ethos of the work that I do with executive teams and any team really. It's look for similarities, look for where we converge. My argument is we need to not just look for gaps and holes and try and plug those, but actually look at where do the people we have right now, where do we diverge, and how do we make the best use of that? Because I think there's a huge opportunity in that. We don't always need to strive for harmony, but how do we kindly and respectfully have debate and conflict? And what's actually going on when we do diverge in our thinking? And the best strategy, as you say, regardless of what sort of strategy it is, comes from where we have some really good conversation. How do we help each other in the delivery of that strategy? So I think a really kind thing for any team, regardless of level in the hierarchy of the organization, is if everybody was to turn up and each day say to themselves, how can I help Ken do what he needs to do? How can I help Sonia do what she needs to do? That's not do your job for you, but what can I do to make that easier? And if you thought the same for us, and Sonia thought the same for the two of us, it wouldn't mean that we go around in circles. It would mean we actually bring to the surface the barriers, the things we're really struggling with, and it would actually clear the path of helping us to define and decide what is the work in executing the strategy. Because all the organizations I work with, there's not a single one that does not fill itself with busyness, just because they're in that holding pattern going, I actually don't know what we're doing, what the direction is like. And so busyness is just trying some stuff, and trying some stuff is great. However, we've got to have it's got to be meaningful trying of stuff.
We believe we've got the first scalable, clean, baseload and dispatchable power source. When we say that, it's just a lot of adjectives kind of all lumped together, and maybe not a lot of people know what all those mean together. So it sometimes is often helpful to kind of talk about what each of those adjectives mean in their context. So a clean energy source, we're typically referring to energy sources really that have little to no impact on the environment. And that impact can be defined based on how heavily we weight things like carbon emissions, land and water impacts like water intensity, and things like secondary impacts such as rare earth metals intensities. And like we've talked about already, people typically think of the clean energy sources as wind, solar, traditional geothermal, and maybe even nuclear and hydroelectricity, depending on how your ESG definition really. Our value proposition here at Ever is that our Everloop technology is basically all forms of those things. Not only is it clean, it's scalable. You can add investment dollars to it, and the production should hopefully scale linearly with each investment dollar. We can provide some minimum level of power, and in addition to that, we can also ramp up and down to maybe make up for some flagging energy sources as maybe the wind is blowing or the sun's not shining.
If there's an existing grid, and I think you did touch on it when you said it can supplement or support areas where there's intermittent sources like solar. So you can feed into an existing grid a certain amount of your power being generated. Is that so that you're supportive. You're not necessarily only source going into a grid. Am I understanding that right?
That's right. And depending on the electricity market or the power purchase agreement or wherever the technology is located, an Everloop is theoretically capable of providing electricity on its own to a set of end users. But I think the way to real commerciality is becoming a part of this total grid solution, where the total grid is a combination of wind, solar, some of our current fossil fuel sources. But we believe that adding in an Everloop or a bunch of Everloops to a grid can actually add more value and provide additional resilience. Even though lots of people would say, oh, Everloops are too expensive right now. That's correct right now, but as we come down a learning curve, like most technologies do, we believe we have line of sight to costs in the $46 a megawatt hour range, which makes it really cost competitive.
But the way IQ is different from the other incubators and accelerators that are part of UFT is that we have a focus on social enterprises and in supporting underrepresented groups in entrepreneurship. So we care a lot in creating programming that is inclusive, and we try to support those folks that haven't had support for other programs before. So we have programming for indigenous entrepreneurs, we have program for 2S LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs, for female entrepreneurs, and so on. So many of our programs have that equity, diversity, and inclusion lens.
Jonathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Redbird?
Sure, yeah, so I'm Anishinaabe from a community called Saugeen, which is located in southern Ontario. I've been working in the entrepreneurship and economic development space my whole life. Started very early working out of Humber College and supported Humber with an elder, Shelley Charles, who's from Nawash First Nation. And her and I created the Aboriginal Resource Center at the time. There was no Aboriginal resource services provided at the college.
So Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about some of the individuals who are in the cohort, some of the challenges that they look to solve together?
Yeah, so in our first cohort, we had individuals who were from every province, including the territories, from folks who lived or grew up on reserve and currently on reserve, to folks that are living in urban settings and struggling to find their place in an urban setting where real estate costs are significantly higher, where reserve real estate does not have a market, it does not have appreciation, and no intergenerational wealth was created off the land like how immigrants have came here and purchased land with mortgages and accumulated significant wealth from the land. So Indigenous people are leaving the reserve and coming to cities and struggling. It's too costly to own a home. It's becoming very costly to live. And so the group of individuals from all across the country, from remote communities that people were living in the bush, still hunting and foraging and living off the land, came together and wanted to solve the problem that urban Indigenous people are facing. So it wasn't a problem that they were facing, but they understood it might be a problem for their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Essentially, what we came together to try to solve was food sovereignty, to teach them how to enable urban Indigenous people to connect to the land, to connect to plant medicines, and to share that knowledge of food and medicine. In the 12 weeks, in a short time, we came up with this problem and this solution. However, after 12 weeks, it was tough to continue working virtually and isolated and to coordinate. So we at Redbird Circle and at iCube and at the University of Toronto, we said we need to continue this vision, this mission.
So it's long been known that social isolation has a very negative impact on psychological health and even physical health. The presence of a connection, a social network, whether that's family, friends, or otherwise, even professional connections, connectivity around a person is strongly correlated with all sorts of life outcomes, quality of life, and health, welfare, and especially psychological health. The neuroscience of that is fairly straightforward. If you talk about the opposite, or the opposite, isolation is correlated with stress and anxiety and loneliness, and that's very corrosive to the brain. It's corrosive to parts of the brain that are very important for engagement, for activity, for just getting up and doing stuff, and that ends up being very detrimental to someone's health.
We certainly feel that we're in very sort of uncharted waters. Things have the adoption of digital technology, particularly with, say, video calls, has changed so dramatically in such a short period of time. It's really accelerated, I think, trends that were already there. And to sort of name two of them, one is, of course, we know that there is a significant number of older adults who are aging in Canada, right? Far more so than, in terms of ratios and percentages of the populations than we've ever sort of been used to dealing with. But another factor is, every year that passes, the folks who are considered in the category of older adults are increasingly tech savvy. If I think about my own parents or loved ones, they're either sort of in or on the cusp of that sort of cutoff, and they're very tech savvy. This type of technology does not scare them in the least. So I think you're facing two very powerful trends that will encourage and necessitate the involvement of digital technology in delivering healthcare, and I include loneliness and mental health in that umbrella, to seniors and elderly in this country and for beyond its borders as well. What that will look like, what role digital technology is going to play, very undefined, I think. Lots of experimentation, lots of research, lots of idea generation that's, I think, happening now. And it's kind of exciting in a very, very sort of tiny way to be, sort of part of that and thinking about it, and trying to see how can we meet the needs of these people using these new mediums and vehicles.
Companion Link, the work that the two of you are doing, and a lot, with a lot of help, obviously, and support, it's an incredible thing. And as our time comes to a close today on Say Hi to the Future, just the last question is really, why Franco? Why David? Meaning, almost everybody recognized the need around social isolation during the pandemic. The two of you did something, and that's unique. That's wonderful. But what drove you to not just talk about the issue, but to attack it?
Well, look, for me, and I think a lot of people come to causes this way if it impacts them personally. You have personal tragedy. It really sort of aligns you to the challenge at hand, and that's absolutely the kind of experience that I underwent. I love public service. I believe in giving back. So I was maybe I had the right character to be impacted and sort of undergo that. But I will say, I got lucky because I strongly suspect that there were lots of people out there like me who wanted to do something, but the sort of path to do that wasn't clear, and the path for me was largely illuminated by meeting these sort of key people, and going, okay, that makes sense. We could do that. That sounds great. I'd love to push that forward. So I was just very lucky to connect with Franco, and be given the opportunity to rise to that challenge.